In the deepest folds of the Appalachian Mountains, there are valleys and hollows that have names. Names whispered by the old folks. Names like Moan Hollow. They say it wasn't the wind that gave it that name. It was the sorrow that soaked into the ground, a sorrow that belonged to one family, the Howards. For generations, their story was told not in letters, but in bruises and broken bones. A rage passed from father to son, as sure as their blue eyes and stubborn chin. The legends say it was a curse, a witch's dying breath, or a deal made with the devil in a dark coal mine. But what if the truth is something colder, something more terrifying than any ghost story? What if the monster wasn't a spirit from the woods, but a demon that lived right inside their own home, passed down like a family heirloom? Today, we will separate the rumors from the facts and find out what really happened to the men of the Howard family. Was it a curse that doomed them, or was it a chain of pain they forged themselves? Before it was called Moan Hollow, it was just a nameless fold in the earth, a sanctuary carved by a silver creek. The mountains rose up on all sides like silent green-robed giants, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual blue haze. It was a true oasis, hidden in the wild and rugged lands. The forests were thick with chestnut and oak, teeming with deer and turkey. The soil in the narrow bottomland was black and rich. It was a place where a man willing to work until his hands bled could build a life from nothing. And that's exactly what Jedediah Howard came to do. He was the first of them, a man who carried the chill of the Scottish Highlands in his bones and a fierce hunger in his heart. He'd left the old world behind, a world of landlords and famines, and saw in this untamed Appalachian wilderness a kingdom waiting to be claimed. He was a hard man, to be sure, with eyes as cold and clear as a winter stream, but his toughness was first turned against the land itself. He felled trees that were ancient when his grandfather was a boy. He broke the soil with his own back, and he raised a small, sturdy cabin stone by stone. For a time, there was peace in that hollow. Jedediah took a wife, a quiet woman named Elspeth, and soon the silence of the valley was broken by the cry of their firstborn son, Silas. Their life was a rhythm of seasons and survival. They were governed by the rising of the sun and the ache in their muscles. They feared the hard frost and the dry summer, but they feared little else. They were poor, but their barn was full. They were isolated, but they were self-sufficient. Jedediah had done it. He had carved out a piece of the world that was his, and his alone. But the mountains keep secrets. And the story the neighbors told was that this piece of the world hadn't been empty when Jedediah arrived. They said an old Cherokee woman had lived there, a healer who knew the secrets of the herbs that grew in the dark places of the woods. The official record says Jedediah bought the land fair and square, a simple transaction. But the whispers said something different. They said the deal was less of a purchase and more of an eviction. They said she didn't leave quietly. And so, a shadow lingered at the edge of their hard-won peace. Sometimes, Elspeth would swear she saw a flicker of movement by the ancient oak at the edge of the property. At night, when the fire burned low, the wind blowing through the gorge would sometimes sound like a mournful voice, a lament. Jedediah Howard had built his home, but he didn't know that the foundation was laid on a grievance. He believed he had conquered the wilderness, but he hadn't yet learned that some debts aren't paid with money, but with blood. The storm was gathering, and it would bear his family's name. Now, in the mountains, a good neighbor is worth more than a good mule, but Jedediah Howard never found one. The closest family, the Suttrys, lived a mile down the creek, and they looked upon Jedediah's prosperity with a sour eye. The patriarch, Elias Suttry, was a man whose family had been hunting and trapping in these hills for 2 generations before the Howards arrived. He told anyone who would listen that the fertile bottomland Jedediah had claimed was promised to him, that he'd been on the verge of filing the deed himself. The Suttrys felt the land had been stolen right from under them, and their resentment simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. The old wound festered over a property line. A small creek separated their lands, and after a spring flood one year, the water changed its course, carving a new channel that gave a few more acres of rich soil to the Howards. To Jedediah, it was an act of God. To Elias Suttree, it was theft by water and a sign of Howard's devil's luck. It came to a head at the crossroads store, where words, sharp and heavy as stones, were thrown. No punches were exchanged, not yet, but a line was drawn. Suttree swore that creek would one day run with more than just rainwater. It wasn't spoken of loudly after that, but memories in the mountains are as long as a winter's night. This bitter dispute was the dry kindling, and the legend of the Cherokee woman was the spark. The Suttrees and their kin started repeating the story, adding their own dark embellishments. When one of Jedediah's cows took sick and died, it wasn't colic, it was the curse. When a late frost killed the Howards' apple blossoms, it wasn't the weather, it was the witch's revenge. The story of the curse became a social weapon, isolating the Howards and marking them as other. People who had once nodded a greeting now looked away. The Howard land, once seen as a testament to hard work, was now viewed as a place of bad blood. And so, the hollow became a pressure cooker. Inside the Howard cabin, the whispers from the outside world turned Jedediah's heart to granite. He saw enemies in every shadow. His wife Elspeth grew more withdrawn, her silence a constant, fearful prayer. And young Silas, he was being raised on a diet of resentment and suspicion. His father taught him to read the weather and to mend a fence, but the real lessons were unspoken. He learned that the world was hostile. He learned that a Howard trusts no one but another Howard. And he learned that any sign of weakness would be seized upon by your enemies. He was being forged in a crucible of suspicion and pride, being shaped into the perfect instrument to carry the family's legacy, whether it was a blessing or a curse. The harvest festival that year was supposed to be a time of truce. For one day, families set aside their grievances to celebrate the bounty of the land. There was music from a fiddle and banjo, the sweet smell of roasting meat, and the amber glow of moonshine being passed in a jar. And in that brief moment of peace, a dangerous seed took root. Silas Howard, now a young man with his father's solid build but his mother's quiet eyes, saw Sarah Suttree. She was Elias Suttree's youngest daughter, and a young man's heart doesn't care much for property lines or old grudges. They stole glances across the crowd, their secret a fragile spark in the midst of a simmering hate. That spark became a fire when the dancing started. Under the light of the harvest moon, Silas asked Sarah to dance. It was a reckless, defiant act. For the length of one song, they were just a boy and a girl, lost in the music, the world of their fathers fading away. But it was a world that wouldn't be ignored. Sarah's two older brothers, Caleb and Joshua, saw it all. They were their father's sons through and through, barrel-chested and quick to anger, and they saw a Howard's hands on their sister as the ultimate trespass. The music hadn't even finished before they pulled Sarah away and cornered Silas behind the barn. The first words weren't about the dance. They were about the land, the creek, the old rumors. They called him the son of a thief and a witch lover. They sneered that the curse was already showing in his eyes. Silas, raised on a strict diet of Howard pride, stood his ground. He didn't say a word, but his silence was louder than any shout. The taunts escalated, his family's name dragged through the mud with every curse. Then Joshua Suttree shoved him hard against the rough-hewn planks of the barn wall. Silas shoved back, and the festival was over. It was 2 against 1, a brutal, clumsy fight fueled by moonshine and generations of bad blood. Silas was strong, but they were stronger. They beat him to his knees, his face in the dirt. But as Caleb raised a heavy boot to stomp his hand, Silas's desperate eyes landed on a heavy wooden mallet left behind from setting up the tents. With a guttural roar, he lunged, swinging the mallet in a blind arc. There was a sickening crack of wood against bone. Caleb Suttree collapsed to the ground, his arm bent at an unnatural angle, a shard of white bone peeking through his skin. Blood, dark in the moonlight, soaked into the dry earth. The screams that followed silenced the fiddle for good. The community scattered, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. Elias Suttree, his face a mask of pure fury, cradled his screaming son and pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "You'll pay for this, Howard," he choked out. "Your whole damned family will pay." Back in his own cabin that night, Jedediah didn't tend to his son's cuts and bruises. He looked at the blood on Silas's knuckles, at the fire in his eyes, and saw not a mistake, but a beginning. The whispers were over. The time for waiting was done. In both the Howard and Suttree homes that night, rifles were taken down from the wall and carefully, methodically cleaned. The first drops of blood had fallen, watering the seeds of a war that would consume them all. The revenge came not with a warning, but with the quiet mist of the following dawn. Jedediah Howard was at the woodpile, the rhythmic thud of his axe, a familiar heartbeat in the hollow. He was splitting kindling for the morning fire, a simple, honest chore. The air was still and damp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and wet earth. Then came a sound that didn't belong, a sharp crack that wasn't a breaking branch. The axe fell from Jedediah's hand, its blade burying itself in the dirt. He crumpled without a sound, a slow, heavy fall onto the very soil he had claimed as his own. From the cabin, Elspeth heard it, a mother's instinct, a wife's dread. She threw open the rough-hewn door, her question dying on her lips as she saw the dark shapes of Elias Suttree and his son Joshua emerging from the tree line, rifles in hand. The air filled with a blood-curdling scream, and then there was a dull thud, and the scream was cut short. A second crack echoed the first. Then an unnatural silence fell over the hollow, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all other sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of the birds, everything. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing quiet. Silas was down by the creek, checking a rabbit snare he'd set the night before. He heard the two shots, spaced just far enough apart to be deliberate. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He didn't think, he ran. He sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at his face, his lungs burning. As he broke through the clearing, the sight of his home stopped him cold. The cabin door was swinging wide open, like a gaping mouth. There were no voices, no movement. The chickens were scattered across the yard, clucking in frantic terror. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was the silence of a place where life had just been violently erased. He crept inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The single room was a scene of pure chaos. A table was overturned, chairs were splintered. A sack of flour had been torn open, casting a ghostly white powder over everything. And there, in the middle of the floor, a single dark boot print was pressed into the spilled flour. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a splash of crimson against the stark white. Near the cold hearth, his mother's favorite wool shawl, the one she was always mending, was cast aside in a heap. He backed out of the cabin, a silent denial screaming in his mind. And then he saw him. His father lay near the woodpile, a place of work, of life. He looked smaller somehow. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the misty sky he would never see again. The world for Silas shrank to that single still image. His father, the unmovable mountain of a man, now just a broken thing on the ground. In that moment, something inside Silas Howard broke. Or perhaps something was forged. The fear, the grief, it was all there, but it was instantly flash-frozen by a rage so pure and cold it burned. The tears would not come. The boy who had danced with Sarah Suttree under the harvest moon was gone, buried in the ashes of his home. In his place stood the son of Jedediah Howard, a vessel for a generation of hate, now filled to the brim. He didn't run to his father. He didn't cry out his mother's name. He walked slowly and deliberately, to the woodpile. He looked down at his father's still face, the face that had taught him that the world was a hard and unforgiving place. Then he bent down. His hand closed around the smooth, worn handle of the fallen axe. As he lifted it, its weight felt familiar, righteous. The curse, whether real or imagined, had found its new champion. Silas Howard stood alone in the clearing, the axe in his hand feeling less like a tool and more like a part of his own arm. He did not weep. Tears were a luxury, and the price of vengeance was paid in sweat and resolve. With a grim, mechanical determination, he went to the small barn and retrieved 2 shovels. He chose a spot under the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the one his mother had always admired. And he began to dig. For hours, the only sound in Moan Hollow was the scrape and thud of a shovel biting into the earth, a solitary, heartbreaking rhythm. He carried his parents, one by one, and laid them to rest. He filled the graves himself, tamping down the soil with the back of his shovel, his movements precise and unhurried. There were no prayers said, no final words spoken. The act itself was the only eulogy. When the grim task was done, he did not go back into the cabin. He stood at the threshold and looked in at the scene of desecration, the spilled flour, the broken furniture, his mother's discarded shawl. This was no longer his home. It was a monument to a promise made in blood. He turned his back on it, leaving the door to swing on its hinges, an open invitation for the wind and the rain to come in and reclaim the place. He took only his father's rifle from the wall, a pouch of shot, a powder horn, and the axe. He walked away from the hollow without a single look back, melting into the deep woods that bordered his land. The hollow fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of a tomb. Word travels slowly in the mountains, but it travels surely. A few days later, a traveling preacher making his circuit found the Howard homestead unnervingly quiet. He saw the 2 fresh mounds of earth under the oak tree and knew instantly what they were. He didn't linger. He spurred his horse and carried the news to the nearest settlement. The story spread like a fever. It wasn't the killing that shocked people. Feuds and violence were a known part of life. It was the manner of it. The killing of a woman. An ambush at dawn. It was an act without honor, and it struck a chord of fear in the scattered community. Families who had feuds of their own looked at their neighbors with new eyes. Locks were bolted that had never been used before. The county sheriff, a portly man named Abernathy, who preferred settling disputes with talk rather than a gun, eventually made the ride out to the hollow. He saw the graves, noted the abandoned cabin, and then paid a visit to the Suttree family. Elias and his sons met him on their porch, their faces like stone masks. They denied everything. They'd been tending their own land, they said, and hadn't seen a soul. With no witnesses and no bodies to examine, Sheriff Abernathy's hands were tied. He made some notes in a dusty ledger, issued a stern warning about mountain justice, and rode away. The law in those mountains moved with the speed of an old man walking uphill, and in this case, it had come to a dead stop. But the story wasn't over. The community knew it. The Suttrees certainly knew it. Silas Howard was gone, but he wasn't dead. He had been swallowed by the mountains, the same ancient, unforgiving wilderness that had forged his father. He was out there, somewhere in the endless ridges and dark ravines. The manhunt had begun, but it wasn't the law that was doing the hunting. A ghost was now stalking Moan Hollow, and Elias Suttree and his sons began to understand that the 2 shots they had fired at dawn were not an ending, but the beginning of a reckoning. Every snapped twig in the woods, every shadow that moved at dusk, now held a terrifying new possibility. Silas Howard was no longer a name, but a whisper on the wind. There was no posse. Sheriff Abernathy had declared the matter closed, a family tragedy best left to the ghosts and the mountains. The hunt that began was a far more personal and primal affair. Elias Suttree and his remaining sons, Joshua and the one-armed Caleb, became both the hunters and the hunted. Their farm became a fortress, and they became its prisoners. They barred the windows at night and took turns standing watch, rifles cradled in their arms, their gazes fixed on the dark, whispering tree line that separated them from their unseen enemy. They were hunting a ghost, a boy they had created and then unleashed. But Silas Howard was no ghost. He was flesh and blood, and he was perfectly at home. The mountains that the Suttrees now saw as a terrifying wall of shadow, Silas saw as his sanctuary and his accomplice. He had been raised in these woods. He knew the hidden game trails, the secret springs, the shallow caves where a man could disappear. The mountains had taken Silas Howard in, adopted him as one of their own. He moved like a deer, lived off the land, and his senses became as sharp as a hawk's. He became a roomer with a rifle, a phantom whose presence was felt in the cold dread that settled over the Suttree homestead. Silas did not launch a direct assault. He was waging a war not on their bodies, but on their minds. The torment began with small, deliberate cruelties. One morning, Elias found a freshly killed rabbit hanging from his porch rail, skinned with the same distinctive knife stroke his own father had taught him. A few nights later, a rock shattered the kitchen window in the dead of night, and when they rushed outside, there was nothing but the chirping of crickets. They started hearing things, the distant rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood deep in the forest, a low whistle on the wind that sounded like a tune Silas used to favor. He was everywhere and nowhere, a constant, invisible pressure that began to fray their nerves raw. The Suttree brothers, once bold and arrogant, became twitchy and paranoid. Caleb, his useless arm a constant reminder of the feud's beginning, was consumed by nightmares. Joshua, the more hot-headed of the two, grew reckless with fury. He'd fire his rifle into the shadows at the slightest sound, his shouts echoing unanswered in the night. The forest that had been his backyard his entire life was now a deadly labyrinth with a monster at its center. The father, Elias, saw his sons unraveling and his own iron will turning to rust. The fear was a poison, and Silas was letting it work its way deep into their souls before he delivered the final blow. The breaking point came a month into the siege. Driven by a mix of rage and cabin fever, Joshua Suttree declared he was going to hunt the hunter. Ignoring his father's pleas, he took his rifle and stormed into the woods, vowing to return with Silas Howard's scalp. He stalked through the familiar forest for hours, his anger making him clumsy, his shouts making him an easy target. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, he found himself in a part of the woods he didn't recognize. A sudden snap of a twig behind him made him spin around. He saw nothing. A cold dread, colder than any winter morning, washed over him. He knew in that instant that he was not the hunter. He was the prey, and he had walked right into the center of the web. They found him at dawn, not 50 yards from his own tree line. Elias Suttree, his face a pale, haggard mask, followed the trail of broken branches his son had left. He didn't find a man. He found what was left. Joshua was slumped against the base of a massive pine tree. There was no sign of a struggle, no gunshot wound. A single dark mark on his temple showed where the butt of a rifle had struck with brutal final force. But it was the other detail that made Elias's blood run cold. Lying neatly on Joshua's chest was the family axe, the one Silas had taken from his father's woodpile. Its blade was clean. It had not been used to kill, but to send a message. One Suttree was down. The ghost had a taste for blood, and his work was not yet finished. There was no trial held in the county courthouse for the death of Joshua Suttree. The only court in session was the court of public opinion, and the verdict was delivered in hushed tones and averted eyes. When Elias and Caleb carried the pine box to the small family plot on the hill behind their house, only a handful of distant cousins came to stand with them. The rest of the community stayed away, their absence a silent, damning judgment. They weren't mourning Joshua, they were watching the Sutri family be consumed by a fire of their own making. The law of men had failed, and now the older, harsher law of the mountains was handing down its sentence. The Sutri homestead became a courtroom and a prison all in one. Elias and Caleb were the accused, and Silas Howard was the unseen judge, jury, and executioner. The farm began to die around them. Fences sagged, weeds choked the cornfields, and the livestock grew thin from neglect. How could they work the fields when their eyes were constantly scanning the tree line? How could they sleep when every creak of the floorboards sounded like an intruder? Elias, the once proud patriarch who ruled his family with an iron fist, was reduced to a hollow-eyed old man, watching his world crumble one terror at a time. The legacy he had fought to build was being systematically dismantled by the ghost of a boy he had wronged. Caleb, however, was haunted by more than just fear. With his useless dangling arm, a constant aching reminder of his role in starting the feud, his spirit began to break. He started drinking heavily, seeking courage in a jar of corn liquor that only brought forth the demons of his guilt. In his drunken stupors, he would whisper his mother-in-law's name, swearing he saw her face in the shadows. He raved about a curse, not the one they had mockingly pinned on the Howards, but a real one, a curse of blood they had brought upon themselves that day at dawn. The trial within the Sutri home reached its climax one moonless night. Fueled by whiskey and terror, Caleb finally turned on his father. He stood in the middle of the cabin, his one good hand trembling, and screamed the truth into the suffocating silence. He shrieked about the look in Elspeth Howard's eyes, about the silence after the second shot, about the blood on their hands that would never wash away. "It's him. He's not a man. He's a spirit. And he's come for us." Elias tried to silence him, to slap the hysteria out of him, but the dam of denial had burst. The truth, ugly and raw, now filled the space between them. The verdict was delivered just before the next sunrise. Caleb Sutri, stripped of his bravado and his sanity, seemed to find a strange and sudden calm. He walked out onto the porch, unarmed, his face pale in the grey pre-dawn light. He took a deep breath of the cold mountain air, and then, in a voice that was not a shout, but a weary plea, he called out a single name into the mist-shrouded woods. Silas. He stood there, a man offering himself up to the inevitable. A moment passed, then another. And then, from the dark, silent wall of trees, a single shot rang out, sharp and final. It was an answer, an execution, a mercy. Was this justice? A circuit judge would have called it murder. But in the hollows and hills, where life was cheap and honor was everything, the story was told differently. They said Silas Howard was simply balancing the scales. He had taken an eye for an eye, a son for a mother, a brother for a father. Elias Sutri was now utterly alone, a king of a dead and haunted kingdom, left to live with the ghosts he had created. The law of men had never laid a hand on him, but the justice of the mountains had delivered a sentence far worse than a hangman's noose. It had taken everything. Elias Sutri didn't die from a bullet. He died from silence. He lived out his remaining years in that hollow, a ghost in his own home, surrounded by the ghosts of his sons. His land went fallow, and his name withered on the vine. When he finally passed, no one was there to mark the occasion. The Sutri line, once a source of pride, ended in a weedy, forgotten grave on a lonely hillside. Their story became a cautionary tale about the price of hate. And Silas Howard, the avenging angel of the hollow, walked out of the mountains and into a bigger, bloodier war. When the nation split apart, he joined the Union Army, perhaps seeing in the chaos of the Civil War a place where a man with his particular skills could belong. He saw the horrors of Gettysburg, a slaughter that made his family feud look like a schoolyard scuffle. But the war didn't wash away his sins. It just baptized him in a new kind of hell. He returned a broken man, quiet and cold, the fire of righteous vengeance replaced by the hollow emptiness of trauma. It was this Silas, the soldier with the haunted eyes, who would eventually take a wife and have a son of his own, passing down not a name, but a darkness. The curse had found its vessel for the next generation. If you were to go looking for Moan Hollow today, you wouldn't find it on any map. But the locals could point the way. The Suttree place is gone, reclaimed entirely by the forest. A place where people say the weeds grow a little too thick and the birds sing a little less sweetly. The Howard cabin was swallowed by the woods too. All that remains today is a pile of moss-covered foundation stones and a single stubborn chimney standing like a tombstone for a home. They call it the Howard Chimney now, a local landmark where teenagers dare each other to spend the night. And the 2 mounds of earth under the ancient oak tree? They are still there, sunken and subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But they are there. The paper trail of this tragedy is thin, a few lines in a dusty county ledger about a land dispute. But the mountains have a longer memory. The story of the Howards and the Suttrees isn't written in ink. It's carved into the landscape itself, in the names people whisper, in the ruins they avoid after dark. Though most people have forgotten the details, the sorrow has soaked into the soil and the mountains remember everything. So we come back to the question that started it all, the question whispered around campfires in these mountains for over a century. Was the Howard family doomed by a supernatural curse? It's a powerful story, the idea of a witch's hex or a deal with the devil. It gives a name to an evil that feels too big and too relentless to be human. But the truth, as it often is simpler and somehow far more tragic. The real curse wasn't a whisper on the wind. The real curse was the silence between neighbors nursing old grudges, the silence of a man who can't speak his pain, and the ringing, final silence after a gunshot. This is a story not just of cruelty, but of the formidable, unyielding Appalachian spirit, a spirit forged in hardship and isolation. It's a story of the fierce pride that can build a life on a steep mountainside with nothing but bare hands, and the terrible pride that can tear that same life apart over a single insult. The Howards weren't monsters. They were men, trapped in a cage built by poverty, ignorance, and trauma. Each generation inherited the pain of the last, and the only tool they were ever given to deal with that pain was rage. Silas Howard didn't learn his violence from a demon in a mine. He learned it in the silence of a father who never showed him love, and in the screams of a mother he couldn't protect. The names on the headstones have faded, and the cabins have crumbled back into the earth. But the lesson of Moan Hollow remains, a quiet warning carried on the mountain breeze. It teaches us that the most terrible ghosts are the ones we create ourselves, the ones that live inside our own families. The story of the Howards is a bitter parable about how a man can escape a war, can escape a hollow, but can never truly escape the legacy of his father's hands. And now, my friends, you know the story of Moan Hollow. And you know why the old folks say, even on a still day, the wind in that valley still sounds a little like weeping.